Welcome back to Her True Stories, where we share real experiences of women who faced the unthinkable and found the strength to survive and thrive. Today's story comes from Martha, a 58-year-old grandmother whose own family tried to poison her. This is her harrowing tale of betrayal, survival, and the ultimate revenge. My name is Martha Benjamin, and I want you to understand something from the very beginning. I am not the kind of woman people expect to be dangerous. At 58, I've been blessed with what people call good genes, smooth skin that doesn't betray my age, auburn hair that I keep perfectly styled, and a figure that still turns heads when I walk into a room. I dress well, speak softly, and smile graciously at family gatherings. But appearances, as they say, can be deceiving. The evening that changed everything started like so many others, with a family dinner I didn't want to attend. It was a Thursday in late October, and the leaves outside my son Mark's suburban home were turning that brilliant shade of gold that makes Ohio autumns so beautiful. I'd driven the 20 minutes from my own house in the historic district, bringing a bottle of expensive wine and my usual mask of polite interest in my daughter-in-law's domestic theatrics. Lila had been married to my son for 12 years, and in all that time, she'd never once made me feel welcome in their home. Oh, she was polite enough, always calling me Mrs. Benjamin instead of Martha, always asking about my health with that particular tone that suggested she hoped the news wouldn't be good. But there was something cold in her pale blue eyes, something calculating that I'd noticed from the very first time Mark brought her home. Tonight felt different, though. More tense, more purposeful. "Martha, you look lovely as always," Lila said as she opened the door, her smile as sharp as a blade. She was 34 but looked older, with harsh blonde highlights and lips that pursed naturally into disapproval.
Come in, come in.
"Mother's already here."
Ah, yes.
Joan Winters, Lila's mother, was already seated in the living room like a queen holding court. At 72, Joan was a formidable woman with silver hair pulled back in a severe bun and the kind of righteousness that came from never doubting that she was right about everything. She'd never liked me either. I represented everything she thought was wrong with my generation. Too independent, too comfortable with my own wealth, too unwilling to defer to her authority. "Martha," Joan said, using my name correctly for once. "How lovely that you could join us for this special family dinner." Special. There was that word again. Lila had used it 3 times when she'd called to invite me, emphasizing it in a way that made my skin crawl. "Thank you for having me," I replied, settling into the uncomfortable chair they always gave me, the one with the broken spring that made sitting gracefully nearly impossible. Mark appeared from the kitchen, my handsome 36-year-old son, who'd somehow grown from a sweet boy into a weak man who let his wife and mother-in-law run his life. He kissed my cheek with genuine warmth, the only person in this house who still seemed to love me, though even that had been strained lately. "Mom, you look great. How are you feeling?"
I'm fine, sweetheart.
"The same as I was when you asked me yesterday and the day before that." I studied his face, noting the dark circles under his eyes, the way his hands shook slightly when he thought no one was looking. "How are you?" "He's been under a lot of stress at work," Lila answered for him, appearing at his shoulder like a possessive shadow. "We all have. That's actually why we wanted to have this family dinner. To discuss some things that affect all of us." Before I could ask what she meant, my 17-year-old granddaughter Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs. Once upon a time, Chloe had been my little princess, the bright-eyed girl who loved spending weekends at my house, who begged me to tell her stories about her grandfather William and the adventures we'd had before she was born. But teenagers change, and Chloe had changed more than most. Over the past 2 years, she'd grown distant, almost hostile. Tonight, she looked pale and nervous, her dark hair hanging in lank strands around a face that should have been glowing with youth. "Hi, Grandma," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Hello, darling." You look tired. Are you feeling all right? She's fine, Lila interjected before Chloe could answer. Just busy with school. You know how it is. But I didn't know how it was, because no one told me anything about Chloe's life anymore. The invitations to school plays and soccer games had stopped coming. The weekend visits had been postponed indefinitely. The sweet child who used to call me every few days to chat had become a stranger, who could barely look at me. Dinner's ready, Lila announced with false brightness. I made your favorite, Martha, pot roast with all the fixings. She hadn't asked what my favorite was. In fact, I preferred lighter meals these days, but I followed the family into the dining room without comment. The table was set with Lila's good china, another sign that this evening was more significant than a casual family dinner. I took my usual seat, the one that faced away from the windows, while Joan positioned herself at the head of the table like she owned the place. Mark and Lila flanked me on either side, and poor Chloe was relegated to the seat across from me, where she sat picking at her napkin with obvious anxiety. This looks wonderful, dear, I said as Lila served the plates. The pot roast did smell delicious, rich with herbs and wine, the vegetables perfectly roasted. She'd even made Yorkshire pudding, which I knew was a complicated dish. You've outdone yourself. I wanted tonight to be special, Lila said, settling into her chair with a satisfied smile. A real family meal, like the ones we used to have when Chloe was little. We used to have. I'd never been included in many family meals when Chloe was little. But I kept that observation to myself and picked up my fork. That's when Chloe spoke up, her voice sharp with panic. Grandma, please don't touch that food. The entire table went silent. I looked at my granddaughter, seeing something in her dark eyes that made my blood run cold. Fear. Pure, desperate fear. What did you say, sweetheart? Just don't. Please. Her voice cracked, and I saw tears forming in her eyes. Just go now. Chloe. Lila's voice was sharp with warning. What's gotten into you? Apologize to your grandmother right now. But I was watching my granddaughter's face, and I saw something there that changed everything. This wasn't teenage moodiness or disrespect. This was a child trying to save my life. Without saying a word, I reached across the table and switched my plate with Joan's. What are you doing? Joan asked, looking offended. Your portion looks bigger, I said lightly. At my age, I really shouldn't eat so much. Joan huffed, but said nothing as I placed her plate in front of me and moved mine to her spot. The switching was subtle enough that Mark and Lila, busy serving side dishes, didn't seem to notice the exchange. For 10 minutes, we ate in relative silence. I took small bites of Joan's pot roast, which tasted perfectly normal, while making polite conversation about the weather and Chloe's upcoming school dance. Joan, meanwhile, attacked my former plate with her usual gusto, complimenting Lila on the seasoning. That's when it started. Joan's fork clattered to her plate mid-bite. Her face, already flushed from the wine, began turning an alarming shade of green. I don't feel, she began, then pressed her hand to her mouth. She bolted from the table, heading for the bathroom, but she didn't make it. The violent retching started in the hallway, echoing through the house like the sound of her body rejecting whatever poison had been meant for me. Chloe screamed. Mark jumped up from his chair, shouting for someone to call 911. Lila stood frozen, her face white as paper, staring at her mother writhing on the floor. And I sat calmly in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of someone who just confirmed her worst suspicions. Because, you see, this wasn't the first time someone had tried to poison me. It was just the first time they'd been careless enough to let my granddaughter know about it. As the sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, I looked around the table at my family. My son, pale with shock, my daughter-in-law, trembling with what I could only assume was panic at having her plan go so wrong, and my granddaughter, staring at me with a mixture of relief and terror. I knew this day would come, I said quietly, my voice barely audible over Joan's continued retching. What I didn't know was that they'd be so careless about it. The police would be here soon. There would be questions and statements and investigations. My quiet life in my beautiful house would become the center of a very public scandal. But as I watched Joan being loaded onto a stretcher, as I saw the fear in Lila's eyes and the confusion in Mark's, I felt something I hadn't experienced in years. I felt alive. Before we continue with Martha's incredible story, I want to remind you that you're part of something special here. These stories of women who refuse to be victims, who find the strength to fight back against those who would harm them, they matter. They inspire us to trust our instincts and protect ourselves when we must. Don't just listen and leave. Hit subscribe so you'll never miss another story that speaks to your soul. Ring that notification bell. Share this with someone who needs to hear it. And let's build a community where women support each other through every trial. Now, let's discover how Martha got to this moment and what she did next. To understand how I came to be sitting at that dinner table, calmly watching my daughter-in-law's mother being poisoned with food meant for me, you need to understand who I was before I became the target of my own family's murderous intentions. I was 24 when I married William Benjamin, a successful businessman 15 years my senior, who swept me off my feet with his charm, his stability, and his absolute devotion to making me happy. I'd been working as a secretary at his accounting firm, a small-town beauty with big dreams and very little money. William saw something in me that no one else had: potential. He didn't just marry me, he transformed me. He sent me to college to finish my degree, enrolled me in etiquette classes, hired tutors to teach me about art and literature and wine. He wanted me to be the perfect wife for a successful man, and I was eager to become everything he dreamed I could be. For 18 years, we were blissfully happy. We traveled the world, entertained beautifully, and built a life of comfort and luxury that exceeded my wildest childhood dreams. William's business grew into a small empire of real estate investments and financial planning services, and I learned to manage both his household and his social obligations with increasing skill and confidence. Mark was born when I was 30, a beautiful baby who became the center of our world. William had worried that fatherhood would change our relationship, but if anything, it deepened our bond. We were a team, united in our determination to give our son every advantage we'd never had. And then, when Mark was 12 and I was 42, William died of a massive heart attack while playing golf on a beautiful Saturday morning. I was devastated, of course, but I was also practical. William had left me very well provided for. His life insurance alone was worth over $2 million, and that was before you counted the business, the investments, the property portfolio, and the various trust funds he'd established. I was suddenly a very wealthy widow with an adolescent son, and the rest of my life ahead of me. The transformation that followed wasn't intentional, but it was dramatic. Grief, I discovered, was an excellent motivator for self-improvement. I threw myself into fitness, spending hours at the gym sculpting my body into something that would have made my younger self weep with envy. I updated my wardrobe, learned to do my own makeup like a professional, and developed the kind of timeless style that made people guess my age at least 10 years younger than it actually was. More importantly, I learned to manage William's business empire. What had started as a way to honor his memory became a passion in its own right. I was good at it, better than good. Under my management, the company grew and prospered in ways that William had never imagined possible. By the time Mark graduated from high school, I was 48 years old, worth approximately $8 million, and looked young enough to be mistaken for his older sister rather than his mother. I was also, much to my surprise, enjoying my independence immensely. Mark went to college, Northwestern, where he studied business with the vague intention of eventually taking over the family company. He was a good student, but not a brilliant one, charming but not particularly ambitious. He coasted through his 4 years on his trust fund and his natural likability, graduating with a respectable GPA and no real idea what he wanted to do with his life. That's when he met Lila. She was a junior at a nearby college, studying elementary education with a minor in what she called family financial planning, which seemed to consist mostly of learning how to manage other people's money. She was pretty in a conventional way, with the kind of blonde highlights and perfect teeth that suggested expensive maintenance, and she latched onto Mark with the single-minded determination of a woman who'd found her meal ticket. I didn't like her from the moment I met her. It wasn't just the obvious gold digging, though that was certainly part of it. It was the way she looked at my house during her first visit, her eyes calculating the value of every piece of furniture and artwork. It was the way she asked detailed questions about Mark's inheritance timeline, as if my death was simply a matter of estate planning rather than the loss of a beloved mother. Most of all, it was the way she looked at me, with a mixture of envy and resentment that suggested she saw me as competition rather than family. "She's not good enough for you," I told Mark after that first meeting. "She doesn't love you. She loves what you represent." But Mark was 22 and infatuated, and my concerns only drove him closer to her. Within 6 months, they were engaged. Within a year, they were married in an elaborate ceremony that cost more than most people's houses and was paid for entirely by me. The early years of their marriage were relatively peaceful, mostly because I kept my distance. I traveled extensively, managed my business interests, and tried to give them space to build their own life together. When Chloe was born, I was thrilled to become a grandmother, and for a few years, my relationship with Lila improved significantly. Perhaps she thought motherhood would soften me, make me more manageable. Perhaps she genuinely appreciated my help with babysitting and the generous gifts I lavished on my granddaughter. Or perhaps she was simply biding her time, waiting for the right moment to make her move. Because make no mistake, the woman who tried to poison me that October evening had been planning my demise for years. The only question was when she'd finally work up the courage to act on her fantasies. The first real sign of trouble came when Mark started having financial problems. Despite his college degree and his trust fund, he never developed much business sense. He made a series of bad investments, got involved with a business partner who embezzled from their joint accounts, and generally managed to lose money with impressive consistency. "Mom, I need help," he said during one of his increasingly frequent visits to my house. This was about 3 years ago when Chloe was 14 and still sweet to me. "The business is failing, and I don't know what to do." I could have bailed him out. The amount he needed was relatively small compared to my overall wealth. Instead, I offered him something better, a position in my company, working alongside me to learn the business from the ground up. "I don't want charity," he said, his pride clearly wounded. "I want to make it on my own." "This isn't charity, Mark. This is an education. Learn from me now, and in a few years, you'll be able to run your own company successfully." But Lila had other ideas. "We appreciate the offer, Martha," she said during a family dinner at their house, "but Mark needs to maintain his independence. Perhaps you could just loan us the money? We'd pay it back with interest, of course." She wasn't asking for a loan. She was asking for a gift disguised as a loan, expecting that family loyalty would prevent me from ever demanding repayment. It was the same strategy she'd used for smaller amounts over the years. The unexpected car repair that cost $3,000, the emergency home improvement that required $5,000, the various investment opportunities that somehow never generated any returns. "No," I said simply. "I won't loan you money to throw away on another failed venture." But my offer to work with Mark stands. The temperature in the room dropped about 20 degrees. Lila's smile became rigid, and I saw something flash in her eyes that I'd never seen before: naked hatred. That night marked the beginning of what I came to think of as the Quiet War. On the surface, everything remained polite and civilized. But underneath, Lila began a systematic campaign to turn my son and granddaughter against me. Suddenly, my invitations to family events became infrequent. When I did attend gatherings, I was met with subtle snubs and pointed comments about my unreasonable demands and controlling behavior. Chloe, who had once begged to spend weekends with me, started making excuses about homework and social commitments. Most insidiously, Lila began spreading stories about my mental health. I was becoming forgetful and confused. I was making inappropriate financial decisions and needed guidance from younger, more capable family members. I was a lonely old woman who was losing touch with reality. None of it was true, of course, but repeated often enough, lies begin to sound like truth, especially when they're spoken by someone who's supposed to love you. The poisoning attempt started about a year ago, though I didn't recognize them as such at first. A drink that tasted off at a barbecue, which I poured into a planter rather than finishing. The plant died within hours, but I assumed it was a coincidence. A piece of cake that made me nauseous at Chloe's birthday party. Again, I chalked it up to too much sugar or a minor stomach bug. But the incidents kept happening, always at family gatherings, always involving food or drink that had been specially prepared for me. And always, I noticed, when Joan was present to witness my supposed decline into illness and incapacity. I began to take precautions. I ate before attending family dinners, claiming I was watching my weight. I brought my own beverages, citing dietary restrictions. I became increasingly careful about accepting anything from Lila's kitchen, while outwardly maintaining the facade of a loving grandmother and mother-in-law. And I started planning. Because you see, I hadn't survived 42 years of marriage to a successful businessman, 16 years of running my own company, and countless social and financial challenges by being naive or trusting. If my own family wanted to play games with my life, then I would show them what a real game looked like. The dinner where Joan collapsed was supposed to be my last supper, literally. They'd invited me over to finish what they'd been attempting for months, probably planning to make it look like a heart attack or a stroke brought on by the stress of my advancing age and declining mental health. Instead, it became the opening move in a war they had no idea they'd started. And unlike their amateur attempts at murder, I intended to win. The months following William's death had taught me many things, but perhaps the most valuable lesson was this: people will reveal their true nature when they think you're weak. They'll show you exactly who they are when they believe you're not paying attention, not strong enough to fight back, or too grief-stricken to protect yourself. Lila had mistaken my politeness for weakness and my love for Mark as unconditional surrender to her will. It was a mistake that would cost her everything. The quiet war began with small skirmishes, testing boundaries, probing for weaknesses, establishing the rules of engagement. Lila was subtle, I'll give her credit for that. To the outside world, she appeared to be a devoted daughter-in-law, concerned about my well-being and eager to include me in family activities. But I knew better. It started with the seating arrangements. At family dinners, I was always placed in the most uncomfortable chair, usually with my back to the room, so I couldn't see what was happening around me. During holidays, my contributions to the meal were consistently forgotten or relegated to side dish status, while Lila made sure everyone knew she'd prepared the important dishes. Then came the subtle exclusions. Chloe's school events were mentioned in passing, usually after they'd already happened. Oh, Martha, you would have loved the school play. Chloe was wonderful. I'm sorry we didn't think to invite you. It was such short notice. Family photos became increasingly rare occasions where I was included. When I did appear in pictures, I was positioned at the edges, easily cropped out if necessary. My birthday celebrations were scaled back year after year, while Lila's became increasingly elaborate affairs that showcased her role as the family's new matriarch. But it was the way she spoke about me to others that truly revealed her intentions. I first became aware of this campaign during a chance encounter at the grocery store with Ellen Patterson, an old friend of William's who'd known our family for decades. "Martha, dear, how are you holding up?" Ellen asked, her voice filled with the kind of pity usually reserved for terminal patients. "Lila told me you've been having some difficult times lately." "Difficult times? What do you mean?" "Oh, the memory issues, the confusion about your finances. She said you've been making some questionable decisions and that the family is worried about you." Memory issues. Confusion about finances. Questionable decisions. I spent the rest of that conversation reassuring Ellen that I was perfectly fine, mentally and physically, while internally cataloging exactly what Lila had been telling people about my supposed decline. Over the following weeks, I began to notice the pattern. Friends would ask about my health problems, with concerned expressions. Business associates would inquire whether I was still managing the company, or if I'd turned things over to younger hands. Even my doctor's office called to confirm an appointment I'd never made for a cognitive assessment. Lila was systematically destroying my reputation, painting me as an elderly woman in decline who could no longer be trusted to manage her own affairs. She was creating a narrative that would make my eventual death seem not only natural, but perhaps even merciful, a release from the confusion and incapacity of old age. The truly insidious part was how she used Mark and Chloe as unwitting accomplices in this character assassination. "Mom's been so forgetful lately," Mark would say when people asked about me, repeating stories Lila had fed him about missed appointments and repeated conversations. "We're a little worried about her." Chloe, sweet and trusting at 14, began treating me like I was fragile and confused. "Are you okay, Grandma?" became her standard greeting, delivered with the kind of careful concern you'd show someone recovering from a stroke. The campaign was brilliant in its subtlety. Lila never said anything directly malicious about me. She was simply a concerned daughter-in-law sharing her worries with friends and family. She was being responsible, looking out for an elderly woman who might not recognize her own limitations. But I recognized exactly what she was doing, and I began to fight back in my own subtle ways. I started documenting everything. Every conversation, every incident, every attempt to undermine my credibility was recorded in a detailed journal I kept locked in my bedroom safe. I began carrying a small digital recorder in my purse, capturing conversations that might prove useful later. I also started testing them, setting small traps to see how far they were willing to go. I mentioned, casually, that I was considering updating my will to reflect some new charitable interests. Within a week, Lila had scheduled a family dinner to discuss my estate planning concerns. I told Mark I was thinking about selling the house and moving to a smaller place. Suddenly, Lila was researching lovely senior communities and bringing me brochures for facilities that specialized in memory care. Most tellingly, I began paying closer attention to the food and drinks served at family gatherings. And that's when I noticed the pattern that would eventually save my life. The first incident I could identify in retrospect happened at Easter dinner, 6 months before Joan's poisoning. Lila had prepared a beautiful ham with all the traditional fixings, and she'd made a special glaze just for me because she knew I preferred things less sweet than the rest of the family. The ham was delicious, but about an hour after eating it, I felt violently nauseous. I excused myself to the bathroom, where I was sick for nearly 20 minutes. When I returned to the table, pale and shaky, Lila was full of concern. "Oh, Martha, you poor thing. Maybe you picked up a bug somewhere. Or it could be your medication. Sometimes those pills can upset your stomach." Everyone accepted this explanation, including me at the time. But looking back, I realized that no one else had gotten sick, despite eating from the same dishes. Only my specially prepared portion had caused problems. The second incident was at Chloe's 15th birthday party. Lila had made individual cupcakes for everyone, decorated with our names in beautiful frosting script. Mine was chocolate with raspberry filling, my supposed favorite, though I never expressed any particular preference for that combination. I took one bite and immediately tasted something bitter underneath the sweetness. It was subtle, easily masked by the rich chocolate and tart raspberries, but it was there. I discreetly wrapped the cupcake in a napkin and threw it away later, claiming I was too full to finish it. That night, I carefully unwrapped the cupcake and examined it more closely. The filling had an unusual color and texture, slightly different from what I'd expect from regular raspberry jam. I sealed it in a plastic bag and put it in my freezer, though I wasn't sure yet what I planned to do with it. The third incident was the most blatant. At a summer barbecue, Joan had prepared a special drink for me, a fruity cocktail she claimed was made with health-conscious ingredients, appropriate for someone my age. The drink was beautiful, garnished with fresh fruit and served in an elegant glass that made me feel special and cared for. But when I raised it to my lips, something made me hesitate. Maybe it was the way Joan and Lila were watching me, their eyes bright with anticipation. Maybe it was the slight chemical smell underneath the fruity aroma. Or maybe it was simple survival instinct. Instead of drinking, I complimented Joan on the beautiful presentation and set the glass down on the patio table. A few minutes later, when everyone was distracted by Mark firing up the grill, I poured the entire drink into the large planter next to my chair. The next morning, all the flowers in that planter were dead. I took photographs of the dead plants and added them to my growing collection of evidence. I also took a soil sample from the planter and had it analyzed by a private laboratory, claiming I was concerned about pesticide contamination in my own garden. The results came back positive for several toxic substances, including oleander extract and what the lab identified as plant-based cardiac glycosides, compounds that could cause heart palpitations, nausea, and, in sufficient quantities, death. That's when I knew for certain that my family wasn't just trying to undermine my reputation or manipulate me into changing my will. They were actively trying to kill me. The realization should have terrified me. Instead, it filled me with a cold, clean anger that sharpened my focus and clarified my priorities. If they wanted to play games with poison, then I would show them what a real expert looked like. Because Lila had made one crucial mistake in her research into my background, she'd assumed that my knowledge of plants and their properties was limited to the decorative garden varieties I grew around my house. She had no idea that my late husband had been an amateur botanist with a particular interest in toxic plants, or that I'd spent years learning from him about the lethal properties of common garden specimens. She didn't know about the extensive library of botanical texts in my study, or the detailed notes I'd kept about William's experiments with plant-based compounds. Most importantly, she didn't know that I'd spent the past year quietly acquiring my own collection of toxic plants, ostensibly for a garden memorial to William, but actually in preparation for exactly this kind of situation. If my family wanted to poison me, then I would give them a masterclass in the art of poisoning. The only question was whether I would be defending myself or going on the offensive. As it turned out, the answer would be both. The call from my lawyer came on a crisp morning in September, exactly 1 month before the dinner that would change everything. I was in my garden, tending to the memorial section I'd created for William, a carefully curated collection of plants that looked beautiful and innocent but carried secrets that could kill. "Martha, we need to discuss the Benjamin Trust," James Morrison said without preamble. James had been William's lawyer and had become mine after his death, handling the complex web of investments and legal structures that protected my wealth. "There's been some activity that concerns me." I set down my gardening shears and gave him my full attention. "What kind of activity?" "Someone has been making inquiries about the trust structure and your estate planning. Detailed inquiries, the kind that suggests they're looking for vulnerabilities or ways to challenge your will." My blood ran cold.
Who?
The inquiries came through a law firm that specializes in estate litigation. I can't tell you exactly who hired them due to attorney-client privilege, but I can tell you that the questions they've been asking suggest someone very close to you is planning to contest your will or have you declared incompetent. I sank onto my garden bench, pieces of the puzzle suddenly clicking into place. The stories about my mental decline, the documentation of my supposed confusion, the careful cultivation of witnesses who could testify to my incapacity, it had all been building toward this moment. James, I need you to explain something to me. If someone succeeded in having me declared incompetent, what would happen to my assets? There was a long pause on the other end of the line. In most cases, a conservator would be appointed to manage your affairs. If that person happened to be your next of kin, say, your son, they would have complete control over your finances until such time as you were deemed competent again, or until your death. And if I died while under conservatorship, your will would be executed as written, unless there were grounds to challenge it based on mental incapacity at the time it was drafted. The picture was becoming clearer. They weren't just trying to kill me. They were trying to establish legal grounds to control my money both before and after my death. If the poisoning didn't work, they had a backup plan that would accomplish the same goal through the courts. James, I need you to do something for me. I want you to prepare new estate planning documents, and I want them to include some very specific provisions. Over the next hour, I outline my requirements. If I died under suspicious circumstances, poisoning, accident, or any situation that could reasonably be considered homicide, my entire estate would be liquidated and donated to charity. If I was declared incompetent through legal proceedings, the same provision would apply. If anyone attempted to contest my will based on claims of mental incapacity, they would forfeit any inheritance they might otherwise have received. Most importantly, I wanted a clause that would provide for Chloe's education and future, but only if she could demonstrate that she had not participated in any scheme to harm me or defraud me of my assets. Martha, James said carefully, these are very unusual provisions. Are you concerned about your safety? I'm concerned about protecting myself from people who view my death as a business opportunity. If you're in immediate danger, we should contact the police. I'm not in immediate danger, James, but I am taking precautions. After I hung up, I sat in my garden for a long time, thinking about the magnitude of what I was planning. By creating these new estate documents, I was essentially setting a trap for my would-be murderers. If they succeeded in killing me, they would get nothing. If they tried to have me declared incompetent, they would lose everything. If they attempted to contest my will, they would forfeit their inheritance entirely. But there was one more element I needed to add to the strategy, something that would ensure my survival long enough to see my enemies destroy themselves. I called Margaret Chen, the private investigator I'd hired to look into Lila's background when she first started dating Mark. Margaret was a former FBI agent who specialized in financial crimes and family fraud, and she'd proven invaluable in helping me understand exactly what kind of woman my son had married. I need surveillance, I told her without preamble. Full coverage of my family's activities, with particular attention to any meetings with lawyers, doctors, or other professionals who might be involved in declaring someone mentally incompetent. Are we talking about potential elder abuse? We're talking about potential murder disguised as elder abuse. Margaret was quiet for a moment. Martha, if you believe your life is in danger, you need to contact law enforcement immediately. I need evidence first, and I need to protect myself until I have that evidence. What kind of protection are you talking about? I looked around my garden, at the carefully cultivated plants that had been teaching me their secrets for the past year. The kind that ensures if anyone tries to poison me, they'll get a very unpleasant surprise in return. We arranged to meet the following day to discuss the surveillance parameters and security measures. But as I ended the call, I realized there was one more person I needed to protect in all of this. Chloe. My granddaughter had been growing increasingly distant over the past 2 years, but I'd attributed that to normal teenage behavior and Lila's influence. Now I wondered if there was something more sinister at play. Was Chloe being groomed to participate in whatever they were planning? Was she being fed lies about my mental state to prepare her for my eventual decline? Or, and this thought chilled me to the bone, was she being prepared as a witness to testify about my incompetence when the time came? That evening, I did something I hadn't done in months. I called Chloe directly. "Hi, Grandma," she said, but her voice was subdued, almost fearful. "Hello, sweetheart. I was wondering if you'd like to come spend the weekend with me, like we used to do." There was a long pause. "I don't think Mom would like that." "Since when do you need your mother's permission to visit your grandmother?" "Since, I don't know. Things have been different lately." "Different how?" Another pause, longer this time. "Mom says you've been sick, that you might not remember things correctly, or that you might get confused and do something dangerous." There it was, the poison they'd been dripping into my granddaughter's ears, turning her against me one lie at a time. "Chloe, have I ever seemed confused or forgetful when you've talked to me?" "No," she admitted quietly. "But Mom says that's how this kind of sickness works, that you might seem fine most of the time, but then suddenly you're not. And what do you think? When you look at me, when you talk to me, do I seem sick to you?" There was a very long pause. "No," she whispered. "You seem like the same grandma you've always been. But Mom says I'm too young to recognize the signs." I felt a surge of rage, so pure and clean it took my breath away. They weren't just trying to kill me. They were using my own granddaughter as a weapon against me, poisoning her mind with lies and fears that would make her doubt her own perceptions. "Chloe, I want you to listen to me very carefully. I am not sick. I am not confused or forgetful or dangerous. I am exactly the same person I've always been, and if anyone tells you otherwise, I want you to remember this conversation. But Mom says..." "I don't care what your mother says. I care what you think, what you observe, what you know to be true from your own experience. Can you promise me you'll trust your own judgment about me?" I guess so." "Good girl. And Chloe, if anyone ever asks you to say things about me that you know aren't true, I want you to remember that lying about someone you love is one of the worst things you can do to them." After I hung up, I sat in my kitchen with a cup of tea and planned the next phase of my strategy. It wasn't enough to protect myself from their murder attempts. I needed to expose them, to reveal their true nature not just to the authorities, but to everyone who mattered. Most importantly, I needed to save Chloe from becoming collateral damage in their scheme. The Newell James was preparing would protect my assets and ensure that my murderers gained nothing from my death. The surveillance Margaret was arranging would provide evidence of their conspiracy. But I needed one more element to complete my defense. I needed them to reveal themselves so thoroughly that no one could ever doubt what they'd tried to do. I needed them to attempt to poison me again, but this time under circumstances where their guilt would be undeniable and their actions would have consequences they never anticipated. As I sat in my beautiful kitchen, in the house William and I had shared for so many happy years, I began to plan the dinner party that would end this war once and for all. They wanted to play games with poison? Fine. I would give them a game they would never forget, assuming they survived it. Because unlike their amateur attempts at murder, my response would be precise, devastating, and absolutely final. The invitation came exactly as I'd expected it would. Casual, friendly, and timed perfectly to catch me off guard. "Hi, Martha." Lila's voice was bright with false cheer when she called 3 days after my conversation with James about the new will. "I know this is short notice, but would you like to come to dinner Thursday night? It's been too long since we've had a proper family meal together." Too long. It had been exactly 6 weeks since the last family gathering, when I'd nearly been poisoned by Joan's special cocktail. But apparently they decided it was time to try again. "That sounds lovely, dear. What's the occasion?" "No special occasion. I just feel like we've all been so busy lately and family is important." Mom will be there too. She's been asking about you. Joan had been asking about me. I was sure she had been, probably asking when I was going to die so they could get on with their lives. Should I bring anything? Oh no, don't worry about that. I want to do all the cooking myself. I've been trying some new recipes, and I'd love to get your opinion on them. New recipes. How thoughtful of her to experiment on me. I'm looking forward to it, I said, and I genuinely was. Not to the dinner itself, but to what I had planned for afterward. As soon as I hung up, I called Margaretchen. It's happening Thursday night, I told her. I need you to have surveillance in place, and I need you to be ready to call the police the moment things go wrong. Martha, are you sure about this? We could try to gather evidence in less dangerous ways. They've already tried to kill me 3 times, Margaret. If I don't end this now, they'll eventually succeed. At least this way, I control the circumstances. What exactly are you planning? I told her. She was quiet for a long time after I finished. That's either brilliant or insane, she said finally. It's both. But it's also necessary. The next 3 days were spent in careful preparation. I visited my garden multiple times, harvesting and processing the plants I would need. I tested and retested my dosages, using scientific precision to ensure the results would be dramatic but not fatal for everyone except the person who actually deserved to die. I also made several discreet phone calls to ensure that certain people would be available Thursday evening if needed. My doctor, who owed me several favors. A toxicologist at the local university who'd helped me identify the substances in the dead planter. And Detective Sarah Rodriguez, whom I'd met at a charity function and who'd expressed interest in cases involving elder abuse. Most importantly, I spent time with my conscience, making peace with what I was about to do. Was I about to commit murder?
Possibly.
Was I justified in defending myself against people who'd already tried to kill me multiple times? Absolutely. Thursday arrived gray and drizzly, with a kind of autumn chill that made you grateful for warm houses and hot meals. I dressed carefully for dinner, a beautiful burgundy dress that complemented my coloring and made me look vibrant and healthy, diamond earrings that William had given me for our 10th anniversary, and a touch of perfume that reminded me of happier times. If this was going to be my last family dinner, I wanted to look my best. I arrived at Mark and Lila's house at exactly 6 o'clock, carrying a bottle of expensive wine and a warm smile. Lila met me at the door, looking unusually nervous despite her bright greeting. Martha, you look wonderful.
Come in, come in.
The house smelled amazing. Roast beef, herbs, something sweet baking in the oven. Lila had clearly gone to considerable effort to make this meal special. I wondered what she'd hidden in it this time. Joan was already seated in the living room, looking like a queen holding court. She greeted me with a kind of false warmth that made my skin crawl. Martha, dear, how lovely to see you. Mark appeared from the kitchen, looking handsome but tired. He kissed my cheek with genuine affection, and for a moment I felt a pang of regret for what I was about to put him through. But then I reminded myself that he'd been enabling his wife's murder attempts for months, even if he was too weak or willfully blind to recognize them for what they were. Where's Chloe? I asked. Upstairs doing homework, Lila said quickly. She'll be down for dinner. I brought her a little something. I held up a small wrapped box containing a beautiful silver bracelet I'd picked up at an antique shop. Just a small gift to let her know I'm thinking of her. That's very sweet of you. I'll make sure she gets it. But something in Lila's tone suggested the gift would disappear long before it reached my granddaughter. We made small talk for the next 20 minutes. The weather, local news, Chloe's school activities. I complimented Lila on the delicious smells coming from the kitchen and expressed appropriate interest in Joan's latest community volunteer work. To any observer, we looked like a normal, loving family gathering for a pleasant evening meal, which made what happened next all the more shocking. Chloe appeared at the top of the stairs, looking pale and anxious. She'd grown so much in the past year. At 17, she was nearly as tall as her mother, with a kind of natural beauty that needed no enhancement. But tonight she looked younger than her years, fragile and frightened in a way that made my heart ache. "Hi, Grandma," she said quietly, not meeting my eyes. "Hello, sweetheart. You look lovely." She was wearing a simple blue dress that brought out the color of her eyes, but her hands were shaking slightly as she smoothed the fabric. Something was very wrong. "Dinner's ready," Lila announced with forced brightness. Everyone to the dining room. The table was set beautifully with Lila's best china and crystal, candles providing warm light that should have made the scene cozy and intimate. Instead, the atmosphere felt tense, charged with unspoken expectations and hidden agendas. I took my usual seat, the uncomfortable chair facing away from the windows, while Joan positioned herself at the head of the table like she owned the place. Mark and Lila flanked me on either side, and Chloe sat across from me, still looking like she might bolt at any moment. "This looks wonderful, dear," I said as Lila served the plates. The pot roast did look delicious, perfectly cooked and surrounded by roasted vegetables that gleamed with herbs and butter. She'd even made Yorkshire pudding, which I knew was a complicated dish requiring considerable skill. "I wanted tonight to be special," Lila said, her eyes bright with something that might have been anticipation or might have been malice. "A real family meal like we used to have." Like we used to have. When had we ever had meals like this? But I smiled and nodded, playing my role in whatever charade she'd constructed. That's when Chloe spoke the words that changed everything. "Grandma, please don't touch that food." The silence that followed was electric. I looked at my granddaughter and saw something in her eyes that confirmed all my worst fears. She knew what was in the food. She knew what they were planning to do to me. And despite whatever pressure they'd put on her, despite whatever lies they'd told her, she was trying to save my life. "What did you say, sweetheart? Just don't. Please." Her voice cracked with emotion. "Just go now." "Chloe." Lila's voice was sharp with warning and panic. "What's gotten into you? Apologize to your grandmother right now." But I was watching my granddaughter's face, and I saw something there that gave me hope. This child still loved me. Whatever they'd told her, whatever they'd threatened her with, she couldn't stand by and watch them murder me, which meant it was time to spring my trap. Without saying a word, I reached across the table and switched my plate with Joan's. "What are you doing?" Joan asked, looking offended by the breach of etiquette. "Your portion looks bigger," I said lightly. "At my age, I really shouldn't eat so much." Joan huffed, but said nothing as I placed her plate in front of me and moved mine to her spot. The switching was subtle enough that Mark and Lila, busy serving side dishes and trying to process Chloe's outburst, didn't immediately notice what I'd done. For the next 10 minutes, we ate in relative silence. I took small, careful bites of Joan's pot roast, which tasted perfectly normal, rich, savory, seasoned with herbs and wine. Meanwhile, Joan attacked my former plate with her usual enthusiasm, complimenting Lila on the seasoning and asking for the recipe. I watched her eat with the fascination of a scientist observing an experiment. How long would it take? What would the symptoms be? How much had they put in the food to ensure my death? The answers came sooner than I'd expected. Joan's fork clattered against her plate mid-bite. Her face, already flushed from the wine, began turning an alarming shade of green. "I don't feel," she began, then pressed her hand to her mouth. She bolted from the table, heading for the bathroom, but she didn't make it. The violent retching started in the hallway, echoing through the house like the sound of justice being served. Chloe screamed. Mark jumped up from his chair, shouting for someone to call 911. Lila stood frozen, her face white with terror as she watched her mother writhing on the floor. And I sat calmly in my chair, my hands folded in my lap, watching the chaos unfold with the detached interest of someone who just won a very dangerous game. Because this wasn't an accident or a case of food poisoning. This was attempted murder, and now I had all the evidence I needed to destroy the people who'd been trying to kill me. As the sirens wailed in the distance, growing closer with each passing second, I looked around the table at what remained of my family. My son, pale with shock and confusion. My daughter-in-law, trembling with the knowledge that her carefully planned murder had gone catastrophically wrong. And my granddaughter, staring at me with a mixture of relief and terror. I knew this day would come, I said quietly, my voice carrying clearly over Joan's continued retching. What I didn't know was that they'd be so careless about it. The police would be here soon. There would be questions and investigations and arrests. My quiet life would become the center of a very public scandal. But as I watched Joan being loaded onto a stretcher, as I saw the fear in Lila's eyes and the dawning comprehension in Mark's, I felt something I hadn't experienced in months. I felt victorious. The war was over. And I had won. I want to pause here to acknowledge something powerful about Martha's story. She trusted her instincts, gathered evidence, and refused to be a victim even when her own family tried to destroy her. If you're drawing strength from her courage, if her refusal to be silenced resonates with you, please hit that like button and share the story. Your engagement helps us reach more women who need to hear these stories of survival and justice. Comment below if you've ever had to trust your gut when everyone around you is telling you that you were wrong. Now, let's see how Martha's victory plays out. The ambulance pulled away with Joan inside, sirens fading into the distance as neighbors gathered on their porches to watch the drama unfold. Inside the house, chaos reigned as police officers began the process of turning my family dinner into a crime scene. Detective Sarah Rodriguez arrived within minutes of the first responders, her sharp eyes taking in the scene with professional assessment. I'd met Sarah at a charity luncheon 6 months earlier, where we discussed the rising problem of elder abuse in affluent communities. She'd given me her card and told me to call if I ever felt unsafe. I hadn't called her, but I'd made sure Margaret Chen had her contact information, just in case. Mrs. Benjamin, Sarah said, approaching me with the careful demeanor of someone who wasn't sure if she was talking to a victim or a suspect. Can you tell me what happened here? We were having a family dinner, I said, my voice shaking with what I hoped sounded like shock and confusion. Joan, that's my daughter-in-law's mother. She suddenly became very sick. It happened so fast. Had Mrs. Winters been feeling unwell before dinner? Not at all. She seemed perfectly fine when I arrived. We were just talking and eating, and then I let my voice trail off, pressing my hand to my chest in a gesture of distress. Sarah made notes while other officers photographed the dining room and collected samples of food from each plate. I watched them work with the fascination of someone seeing justice in action for the first time. Mrs. Benjamin, I need to ask you about the seating arrangements. Can you show me where everyone was sitting? I walked her through the table placement, pointing out each chair and explaining who had been where. When we got to my chair, I made sure to mention something crucial. This is where I was sitting initially, but I switched plates with Joan about 10 minutes into the meal. You switched plates?
Why?
Her portion looked bigger, and I'm trying to watch my weight. At my age, it's easy to overindulge. I gave her a self-deprecating smile that suggested vanity rather than suspicion as my motive. Sarah made a note that I knew would prove crucial later. If Joan had been poisoned, and the poison was in the food meant for my place setting, then the plate switching would clearly indicate that I had been the intended target. Had you noticed anything unusual about the food? Any strange tastes or smells? No, everything seemed delicious. Lila is an excellent cook. I glanced toward the kitchen, where my daughter-in-law was giving her statement to another officer. Even from a distance, I could see that she was struggling to maintain her composure. Mrs. Benjamin, I have to ask this. Have you had any concerns about your safety recently? Any reason to believe someone might want to harm you? This was the opening I'd been waiting for, the chance to plant the seeds that would grow into a full investigation. Well, I said hesitantly, there have been a few incidents over the past year. Nothing I could really put my finger on, but what kind of incidents? Times when I felt sick after eating at family gatherings. A drink that tasted strange at a barbecue. I probably should have mentioned it to someone, but I didn't want to seem paranoid or cause family problems. Sarah's expression sharpened. Can you be more specific about these incidents? I told her about the Easter ham, the birthday cupcake, and the summer cocktail that had killed my plants. With each detail, I could see her mental filing system categorizing the information as evidence of a pattern rather than coincidental food poisoning. Mrs. Benjamin, do you still have any of these items? The cupcake, samples of the drink, anything that might be tested? Actually, yes. I saved the cupcake in my freezer. I wasn't sure why at the time, but something made me keep it. And I took a soil sample from the planter where I poured the drink after all the flowers died. Sarah's eyebrows rose. You took a soil sample? I was concerned about contamination in my own garden. I had it tested by the university lab. I gave her my most innocent smile. The results showed several toxic compounds, but I assumed it was pesticide runoff from somewhere. I'm going to need copies of those test results, and I'd like to collect the cupcake and any other evidence you might have. Of course. Anything to help figure out what happened to poor Joan. As Sarah continued her questions, I could hear Lila's voice rising in the kitchen, sharp with stress and something that sounded very much like panic. I don't understand how this could have happened. I used the same ingredients I always use, followed the same recipe. Joan must have had an allergic reaction to something, or maybe she's getting sick. She's been under a lot of stress lately. The story was already changing. What had been a perfectly normal family dinner was becoming Joan's pre-existing health problems, her stress levels, her possible allergies. Lila was constructing an alternative narrative in real time, one that would deflect suspicion from deliberate poisoning. But I could see from Sarah's expression that she wasn't buying it. Mrs. Morrison, Sarah said, approaching Lila with professional courtesy, I understand this is a difficult time, but I need to ask you some questions about the meal preparation. Of course, officer. Detective. Whatever I can do to help. Can you walk me through exactly how you prepared the food tonight? What ingredients you used, when you started cooking, who had access to the kitchen? Lila's answers were detailed and defensive, emphasizing how carefully she'd prepared everything, how fresh all the ingredients were, how impossible it would be for anything to have gone wrong. But there were small inconsistencies in her story. Times that didn't quite add up, ingredients she mentioned and then corrected, moments of hesitation that suggested she was editing her account in real time. Most tellingly, when Sarah asked about the seating arrangements and who was supposed to sit where, Lila became flustered. Well, Martha always sits in that chair. It's sort of her regular spot. But then she switched plates with Mother, which was unusual. I mean, Mother had specifically asked for a larger portion because she was so hungry, and then Martha just took it. The implication was clear. Joan had requested the larger portion, Martha had taken it away from her, and now Joan was in the hospital. It was a subtle attempt to make me seem selfish and possibly responsible for what had happened. But Sarah was too experienced to miss the real significance of that detail. So Mrs. Benjamin's original plate, the one that ended up with Mrs. Winters, was prepared specifically for Mrs. Benjamin? Well, yes, but I mean they were all the same recipe. There wasn't anything special about any particular plate. Nothing special about any particular plate. Sarah made a note. But you did mention that Mrs. Winters had asked for a larger portion? Yes, that is. Lila was digging herself deeper with every word. So you prepared one plate with a larger portion specifically for Mrs. Winters, and then Mrs. Benjamin ended up with that plate?
No.
I mean, yes, but it's not like that. Sarah's questions continued, methodically documenting every inconsistency in Lila's story while I sat quietly in the living room, playing the role of the confused elderly woman trying to process a traumatic evening. But inside, I was calculating. Every question Sarah asked, every nervous response from Lila, every piece of evidence the crime scene team collected was building the case that would destroy my would-be murderers. Mark was being questioned separately, and I could hear his bewildered responses from the kitchen. He genuinely seemed to have no idea what had happened, which suggested that Lila and Joan had been operating without his knowledge. That would work in his favor eventually, though it wouldn't save him from the consequences of his willful blindness to his wife's behavior. The most heartbreaking part was watching Chloe. My granddaughter sat huddled on the stairs, wrapped in a blanket someone had given her, staring at the chaos in her home with wide, terrified eyes. Occasionally, officers would approach her gently, asking simple questions, but she mostly just shook her head and whispered that she didn't know anything. She was lying, of course. She'd known enough to try to warn me about the food. But she was also just 17 years old, caught between love for her grandmother and loyalty to her parents, probably terrified that anything she said would make the situation worse. I wanted to comfort her, to tell her everything would be all right, but that would have to wait. For now, she was safer if everyone believed she was just an innocent bystander to her family's crimes. Around midnight, the crime scene team finished their work and the house began to empty of officials. Sarah approached me one final time before leaving. "Mrs. Benjamin, I want you to know that we're treating this as a very serious matter. We'll be testing everything we collected tonight, and I'll need you to come in tomorrow to give a formal statement." "Of course. Whatever you need. In the meantime, do you have somewhere safe to stay? Family or friends who could?" "I'll be fine at my own house," I said firmly. "I have good security, and I don't think anyone would be foolish enough to try anything else after tonight." Sarah nodded, but I could see she was concerned about my safety. "I'm going to have patrol cars drive by your house regularly for the next few days, just as a precaution." After the police left, the house felt like a tomb. Mark sat at the kitchen table with his head in his hands while Lila paced frantically, making phone calls to lawyers and family members. Chloe had disappeared upstairs, probably crying into her pillow and wondering how her world had fallen apart so completely. I gathered my purse and coat, preparing to leave this house of horrors and return to the sanctuary of my own home. As I headed toward the door, Lila intercepted me. "Martha, we need to talk." "I think we've done enough talking for one evening, don't you? This is all a terrible misunderstanding. Mother must have had some kind of reaction to something, or maybe she's getting sick. The police are making this into something it's not." I looked at this woman who'd spent months trying to kill me, who'd poisoned her own mother by accident, who was now trying to convince me that what I'd witnessed was somehow my fault or my misunderstanding. "Lila," I said quietly, "I think you should focus on getting Joan the medical care she needs. Everything else can wait. But the police, the questions they're asking, they think someone did this deliberately. That's insane. We're family. We love you."
Love.
She used that word like a weapon, expecting it to shield her from the consequences of her actions. "If this is how your family shows love," I said, "then I think I prefer being alone." I left her standing in her doorway, watching me drive away into the night. In my rearview mirror, I could see her silhouette framed by the warm light of her house, a house that would never be a home for her family again. Because tomorrow, the real consequences of this evening would begin to unfold. Tomorrow, the tests would come back positive for poison. Tomorrow, the investigation would shift from food poisoning to attempted murder. And tomorrow, I would begin the final phase of my revenge against the people who'd tried to destroy me. The call came at 6:47 a.m., exactly 12 hours after Joan had collapsed in my son's hallway. "Mrs. Benjamin? This is Dr. Patricia Walsh at Mercy General Hospital. I'm calling about Joan Winters." I sat up in bed, instantly alert despite having gotten only a few hours of sleep. How is she? She's stable, but I'm afraid the news isn't good. We've confirmed that Mrs. Winters was poisoned. The blood work shows high levels of cardiac glycosides, specifically compounds derived from oleander and foxglove. Oleander and foxglove. Plants that grew in gardens across the country, beautiful and common and deadly when used by someone who knew what they were doing. Poisoned? But how is that possible? That's what the police are trying to determine. Detective Rodriguez asked me to call you personally because of your unique situation last night. My unique situation. The fact that I'd switched plates with a woman who is now fighting for her life. Doctor, you're saying that whoever did this was trying to poison me? Based on the seating arrangements and the plate switching that Detective Rodriguez described, yes. It appears you were the intended target. I let that sink in, playing the role of the shocked victim, even though this was exactly what I'd expected to hear. Is Joan going to be all right? We're doing everything we can. Cardiac glycoside poisoning is serious, but if we caught it in time, well, we're cautiously optimistic. After the doctor hung up, I lay in bed staring at the ceiling, processing the implications of what had just been confirmed. Joan was alive, which meant she could potentially testify about her daughter's plan to murder me. But she was also a co-conspirator in that plan, which meant her credibility as a witness was questionable at best. More importantly, the official confirmation of poisoning meant that this was now a criminal investigation, with all the resources and authority that entailed. Lila could no longer claim that her mother had simply had an allergic reaction or gotten sick from stress. Someone had deliberately tried to kill me, and now the police knew it. My phone rang again 20 minutes later. Detective Rodriguez. Mrs. Benjamin, I'm sure you've heard from the hospital by now. We need to talk. Of course. Should I come to the station? Actually, I'd like to meet with you at your home, if that's all right. I want to collect that evidence you mentioned, the cupcake, the soil sample, the lab results. An hour later, Sarah Rodriguez sat in my living room, her notebook open, and a digital recorder running on the coffee table between us. I'd prepared coffee and arranged some pastries on my best china, playing the role of the gracious hostess even as we discussed attempted murder. Mrs. Benjamin, I want you to understand that this is now a criminal investigation into attempted homicide. Someone tried to kill you last night, and they very nearly succeeded in killing Mrs. Winters instead. I still can't believe it. I mean, who would want to hurt me? And poor Joan. That's what we're trying to figure out. Let's start with those previous incidents you mentioned. The Easter ham, the birthday cupcake, the summer cocktail. Can you give me exact dates and details about what happened? I walked her through each incident, providing dates, times, witnesses, and symptoms. With each detail, I could see her building a timeline of escalating attempts on my life. And you saved physical evidence from some of these incidents? Yes, though I wasn't thinking of it as evidence at the time. Something didn't feel right, so I kept things. I showed her to my kitchen, where I retrieved the frozen cupcake from my freezer and the soil sample from my pantry. I also provided her with copies of the lab results that had confirmed toxic compounds in the soil. Mrs. Benjamin, this level of documentation is quite remarkable. Most people wouldn't think to save evidence or get lab tests done. My late husband always said I was too curious for my own good. He was a bit of a scientist himself, always testing and analyzing things. I suppose I picked up some of his habits. Sarah bagged the evidence carefully, labeling each item with chain of custody forms. We'll have these tested immediately. If they confirm the presence of the same compounds that poisoned Mrs. Winters, then someone has been trying to kill me for months. Exactly. Now, I need to ask you some difficult questions about your family relationships. Have there been any conflicts, any disagreements about money or inheritance, anything that might give someone a motive to want you gone? This was the moment I'd been preparing for, The chance to reveal the full scope of what had been happening without appearing vindictive or paranoid. "Well," I said hesitantly, "there have been some tensions lately. Nothing I thought was serious, but—" I told her about the inquiries into my estate planning, the rumors about my mental health, the subtle campaign to isolate me from friends and family activities. I mentioned Lila's financial pressures and her apparent belief that my death would solve their problems. "Has anyone explicitly threatened you or suggested that you should change your will?" "Not explicitly, no. But there have been hints. Comments about how I don't really need such a large house at my age, suggestions that I should move to a retirement community, discussions about what would happen to my assets if I became incapacitated." Sarah made extensive notes, occasionally asking for clarification or additional details. When I finished my account, she sat back with the expression of someone who'd just heard a textbook case of elder abuse escalating to attempted murder. "Mrs. Benjamin, based on what you've told me and the physical evidence we've collected, I believe you've been the target of a systematic campaign to either kill you or have you declared incompetent so your assets could be controlled by others. But they're my family. Surely they wouldn't. I'm afraid family members are responsible for the majority of elder abuse cases, including financial exploitation and physical harm. The combination of access, trust, and financial motive makes them particularly dangerous." She paused, studying my face carefully. "I have to ask you this directly. Do you believe your daughter-in-law tried to poison you last night?" I met her gaze steadily, letting her see the pain and betrayal I genuinely felt alongside the calculated anger I'd been nurturing for months. "I don't want to believe it. But if someone put poison in the food that was meant for me, and if Lila was the one who prepared that food, then yes, I think she tried to kill me." Sarah closed her notebook and turned off the recorder. "Mrs. Benjamin, I'm going to be honest with you. We have strong circumstantial evidence, but building a criminal case will require more than what we have right now. We need proof of intent, evidence of planning, something that clearly shows this wasn't an accident or mistake." "What kind of proof?" "Communications between the conspirators. Financial records showing they needed your money. Medical or legal documents related to having you declared incompetent. Anything that demonstrates a clear motive and plan." I nodded thoughtfully, as if considering this information for the first time. But inside I was smiling, because I had exactly the kind of proof she was looking for, carefully collected and documented over the past year. "Detective Rodriguez, there's something else I should probably mention." "What's that?" "I've been keeping detailed records of all these incidents. Not because I suspected anything criminal, but because my doctor suggested I track any unusual symptoms or reactions I might be having. I thought it might be related to medication or aging." I led her to my study, where William's old desk held a locked drawer that contained my insurance policy against exactly this situation. I have a journal documenting every strange incident, every concerning conversation, every time I felt unwell after family gatherings. I also have. I hesitated, as if unsure whether to reveal more. "I have some recordings." Sarah's eyes sharpened. "Recordings?" I started carrying a small digital recorder in my purse after I began feeling paranoid about my memory. I thought if I was really becoming forgetful, I should document important conversations. But what I ended up documenting was... I pulled out the recorder and the journal, setting them on the desk between us. "Detective, I think you should hear some of these recordings, especially the ones from the past few weeks." For the next hour, Sarah listened to carefully selected conversations that painted a damning picture of Lila's intentions. The discussion about my estate planning concerns, the comments about my declining mental state. Most damaging of all, a recording from 2 weeks ago when I'd hidden the device during a family gathering. On that recording, captured when they thought I was napping in the living room, Lila and Joan could be heard discussing the timing and whether the old woman would finally cooperate with what's best for everyone. She's being stubborn about the will changes, Joan's voice said clearly. But if she had another one of those episodes, maybe a worse one this time, it might convince her to be more reasonable about her estate planning. Episodes. Lila's voice responded. Mother, we can't keep relying on coincidence. Sooner or later, someone's going to notice the pattern. Then we need to make sure the next one looks completely natural. No pattern, no suspicion, just an elderly woman whose health finally failed her. The recording continued with discussions of dosage and timing and the importance of making sure Mark remained unaware of the details so he could provide an alibi of ignorance if needed. When the recording ended, Sarah sat in stunned silence for several moments. Mrs. Benjamin, this is a confession to conspiracy to commit murder. I wasn't sure what I was hearing at the time. I thought they might be talking about medical care or assisted living arrangements. But now, after last night, now it's clear they were planning to poison you, and they were discussing how to make it look natural. Sarah's voice was grim. This changes everything. With this recording and the physical evidence, we have more than enough to arrest both Lila Morrison and Joan Winters on charges of conspiracy to commit murder and attempted homicide. What about Mark? He's my son, and I don't think he knew what they were planning. From what I've heard, it sounds like they deliberately kept him in the dark. That might actually work in his favor, legally speaking. But Mrs. Benjamin, you understand that this is going to destroy your family? I met her gaze steadily. Detective, they tried to destroy me first. I'm just making sure they don't succeed. After Sarah left with copies of all my evidence, I sat in my study thinking about the chain of events I'd set in motion. By tomorrow, Lila would be arrested. Joan, when she recovered enough to leave the hospital, would also face charges. The investigation would uncover their financial motives, their systematic campaign to undermine my reputation, and their escalating attempts to either kill me or have me declared incompetent. My family, such as it was, would be destroyed completely. Mark would have to choose between supporting his criminal wife or maintaining a relationship with his mother. Chloe would grow up knowing that her mother and grandmother had tried to murder the woman who loved her most. The price of justice was going to be steep for all of us. But as I sat in that beautiful study, surrounded by William's books and the life we'd built together, I felt no regret. I'd given Lila and Joan every opportunity to change course, to treat me with the respect and love that family members owed each other. Instead, they'd chosen greed and murder. Now, they would live with the consequences of that choice. The phone rang, interrupting my contemplation. Mark's number. Mom, we need to talk. Can I come over? His voice sounded hollow, defeated. I wondered how much he'd figured out about his wife's activities, how much he was prepared to face about the woman he'd married and the mother-in-law who'd been manipulating his family for years. Of course, sweetheart. Come whenever you're ready. An hour later, my son sat in my living room looking like he'd aged 10 years overnight. His hair was disheveled, his clothes wrinkled, and his eyes held the kind of devastation that comes from having your entire world revealed as a lie. The police came back this morning, he said without preamble. They arrested Lila. Oh, Mark. I'm so sorry. They had recordings, Mom. Recordings of Lila and Joan talking about poisoning you. How long have you known? The question hung in the air between us, like a sword. How much should I tell him? How much could he handle? I've suspected something was wrong for months, I said carefully. The incidents at family gatherings, the way I kept getting sick after eating food that Lila prepared specifically for me. But I didn't want to believe it. Why didn't you tell me? What was I supposed to say? That I thought your wife was trying to kill me? Would you have believed me? He was quiet for a long time, staring at his hands. Probably not, he admitted finally. I loved her. I trusted her. I thought she loved me too. She did love you, Mark. In her way. but she loved the idea of your inheritance more. The police said Joan might die. Her own mother, Mom. Lila poisoned her own mother by accident because you switched plates.
I know.
It's horrific. Why did you switch plates? Another crucial question. How much should I reveal about my own role in orchestrating the events of that evening? Chloe warned me not to touch the food. She looked terrified, Mark. When your own granddaughter tells you not to eat something, you listen. Chloe knew. His voice was barely a whisper.
She knew something.
Enough to try to save my life. Mark buried his face in his hands. My God, what kind of house was I raising my daughter in? What kind of woman did I marry? You married a woman who is very good at hiding her true nature. Don't blame yourself for not seeing through her deception. But I should have seen it. The way she talked about you when you weren't around, the things she said about your money and your will. I told myself it was just normal family stress, but deep down, you knew something was wrong.
Yes.
And I did nothing about it. We sat in silence for several minutes, processing the magnitude of what had happened and what was still to come. What happens now? Mark asked finally. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward. You can stand by Lila and try to minimize what she did, or you can accept that the woman you married is a would-be murderer and act accordingly. She's Chloe's mother, and Joan is Lila's mother, but that didn't stop Lila from poisoning her. Now you decide what kind of man you want to be going forward. You can stand by Lila and try to minimize what she did, or you can accept that the woman you married is a would-be murderer and act accordingly. She's Chloe's mother, and Joan is Lila's mother, but that didn't stop Lila from poisoning her. Mark flinched at the harsh truth of that statement. I've already filed for divorce, he said quietly. I can't be married to someone who tried to kill my mother. But Chloe, she's going to need therapy, probably for years. This is going to destroy her sense of security, her ability to trust people. Chloe is strong, and she's smart. She'll survive this. More importantly, she'll learn from it. She'll grow up knowing that actions have consequences, that you can't hurt people without facing justice, and that sometimes the people who love you most are the ones who protect you from your own family. Is that what you did? Protected us from our own family? I looked at my son, this man I'd raised and loved and watched make terrible choices for years, and I chose honesty. Yes, Mark. That's exactly what I did. I protected all of us from the cancer that was growing in our family. And I'd do it again. After Mark left, I walked through my house thinking about the conversation we'd just had. He was going to be all right eventually. The divorce would be difficult, and rebuilding his relationship with Chloe would take time, but he was fundamentally a good man who'd been manipulated by an evil woman. More importantly, he'd finally seen Lila for what she really was. That recognition would protect him from making similar mistakes in the future. As for Chloe, she would need time and therapy and lots of love. But she'd also learned the most valuable lesson anyone could learn. Trust your instincts, protect the people you love, and never let family loyalty blind you to criminal behavior. The phone rang again. Detective Rodriguez. Mrs. Benjamin, I wanted to update you on the case. We've arrested Lila Morrison on charges of attempted murder and conspiracy to commit murder. Joan Winters will be arrested as soon as she's released from the hospital. How is Joan doing? Better. The doctors think she'll make a full recovery, which means she'll be able to stand trial for her role in the conspiracy. And the evidence? Will it be enough to convict them? More than enough. The recordings you provided, combined with the physical evidence and the clear pattern of escalating attempts on your life, make this a very strong case. I'd be surprised if they don't plead guilty to avoid trial. After we hung up, I poured myself a glass of wine and sat in my garden, watching the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and crimson. It was over. The people who'd tried to kill me were in custody. My son was free from his toxic marriage, and my granddaughter was safe from the influence of women who saw murder as a solution to financial problems. Justice had been served, and I had survived. But more than that, I had won. The headlines started appearing the next morning. Wealthy widow targeted by family in poison plot. Daughter-in-law arrested for attempted murder of mother-in-law. Estate inheritance scheme leads to poisoning attempt. I read them over my morning coffee, marveling at how quickly the media had picked up the story. By afternoon, news vans would be parked outside my house, reporters would be calling constantly, and my quiet life would become very public indeed. But I was prepared for that. I'd lived through William's death and the media attention that followed when a successful businessman dies unexpectedly. I knew how to handle reporters, how to control the narrative, and how to protect my privacy while still cooperating with the investigation. The first interview request came from Sarah Chin, an investigative journalist who specialized in white-collar crime and elder abuse. I agreed to speak with her, partly because I wanted my story told accurately and partly because I wanted to ensure that other potential victims might recognize the warning signs of what had happened to me. "Mrs. Benjamin," Sarah said as we sat in my living room 3 days after the arrests, "this case has shocked a lot of people. Can you tell me how it feels to know that your own family was trying to kill you?" "It feels like a betrayal beyond anything I could have imagined," I said honestly. "But it also feels like justice. These people saw me as an obstacle to their financial goals, and they were willing to commit murder to remove that obstacle. Now they're facing the consequences of that choice." "When did you first suspect that something was wrong?" I walked her through the timeline of incidents, the gradual escalation from subtle poisoning attempts to the blatant murder plot that had finally been exposed. I explained how I'd documented everything, how I'd gathered evidence, and how I'd finally confirmed my suspicions. Some people might say you were paranoid, that you were seeing threats where none existed. Some people might say that. But paranoia implies irrational fear. My fear was entirely rational, as the evidence proved. What message would you want to send to other elderly people who might be facing similar situations? Trust your instincts. If something feels wrong, it probably is. Document everything. Save evidence. And don't be afraid to ask for help, even if the people threatening you are family members. The interview was published a week later, and the response was overwhelming. I received hundreds of letters from people who recognized similar patterns in their own families, who'd experienced unexplained illnesses after family gatherings, who'd felt isolated and manipulated by relatives with financial motives. More importantly, several law enforcement agencies contacted me to ask if I'd be willing to speak with other victims or serve as a consultant on similar cases. Apparently, my systematic approach to gathering evidence was unusual and could serve as a model for other potential victims. I agreed to help where I could, but I made it clear that my priority was rebuilding my relationship with the family members who deserved my love and attention. Mark had filed for divorce and was seeking full custody of Chloe, which Lila wasn't contesting from her jail cell. He'd also started therapy to process the trauma of discovering that his wife was a would-be murderer and his mother-in-law was her accomplice. "I keep thinking about all the signs I missed," he told me during one of our weekly dinners. "The way Lila talked about your money, the questions she asked about your will, the way she seemed to celebrate when you got sick at family gatherings. You weren't trained to recognize those signs, Mark. Predators are very good at hiding their true nature, especially from the people they're manipulating. But you recognized them, eventually, and only because I had the luxury of being the target rather than the accomplice. When someone is trying to kill you, it focuses your attention in ways that ordinary family dynamics don't." Chloe was struggling more than Mark, as I'd expected. She was in intensive therapy, trying to process the knowledge that her mother and grandmother had tried to murder the person she loved most in the world. She was also dealing with guilt over not speaking up sooner, even though she was just a 17-year-old girl caught in an impossible situation. "I should have told someone what I heard," she said during one of her visits to my house. I should have protected you better. Sweetheart, you did protect me. You warned me not to eat the food, and that warning saved my life. But I could have done more. I could have called the police or told Dad or... You were 17 years old, living with people who were manipulating and threatening you. You did the best you could under impossible circumstances. Do you think Mom really would have killed you? It was the question she'd been building up to for weeks, the one she needed to ask but was afraid to hear the answer to. Yes, Chloe. I think she would have. Not because she hated me, but because she wanted my money more than she valued my life. Chloe cried then, deep, wrenching sobs that came from the core of her being. I held her while she grieved for the mother she'd thought she had, the family she'd believed in, the security that had been stripped away by criminal greed. But when the tears stopped, she looked at me with William's eyes and said something that made me proud to be her grandmother. I'm glad you fought back. I'm glad you didn't let them win. The legal proceedings moved forward with surprising speed. Both Lila and Joan, faced with overwhelming evidence of their crimes, agreed to plea bargains that would spare them the publicity and uncertainty of a trial. Lila received 15 years for attempted murder and conspiracy, with a possibility of parole after 10 years. Joan received 12 years for her role in the conspiracy, though her sentence was reduced slightly due to her age and the fact that she'd been a victim of her own plot. During the sentencing hearing, I was given the opportunity to make a victim impact statement. I'd thought carefully about what I wanted to say, how I wanted these proceedings to end. Your Honor, I said, standing at the podium and looking directly at Lila and Joan, these women tried to kill me because they wanted my money. They saw me not as a person to be loved and respected, but as an obstacle to their financial goals. Lila kept her eyes down, but Joan stared at me with undisguised hatred. They manipulated my son, traumatized my granddaughter, and turned family gatherings into attempted murder scenes. They destroyed the trust that should exist between family members and replaced it with fear, suspicion, and violence. I paused, letting the weight of their crimes settle over the courtroom. But they failed. They failed because I refused to be a victim. They failed because I gathered evidence and fought back. And they failed because justice still matters, even when the criminals are family members. I looked directly at Lila for the first time since her arrest. I want them to serve every day of their sentences. I want them to understand that actions have consequences. And I want other potential victims to know that it's possible to fight back against family predators and win. The judge thanked me for my statement and imposed the agreed-upon sentences. As the bailiffs led Lila and Joan away in handcuffs, neither of them looked back at the family they'd tried to destroy. After the sentencing, Mark, Chloe, and I went to lunch at a quiet restaurant downtown. For the first time in over a year, we felt like a real family again, smaller than before, but healthier, more honest, built on genuine love rather than manipulation and greed. What happens now? Chloe asked as we shared dessert. Now we rebuild, I said. We create new traditions, new memories, new ways of being family that don't involve poison or lies or people who see us as sources of money rather than human beings. Will you ever forgive them? Mark asked. I considered the question carefully. Forgiveness was complicated when it came to people who'd tried to murder you. I'll forgive them for my own peace of mind, I said finally. But I'll never forget what they did, and I'll never trust them again. Some betrayals are too deep to ever fully heal. As we left the restaurant, I felt lighter than I had in years. The people who'd tried to destroy me were in prison where they belonged. My real family was safe and healing, and I was free to live the rest of my life without looking over my shoulder or wondering if every meal might be my last. Justice had been served, and it tasted better than any dinner I'd ever been invited to. 6 months after the sentencing, I received a letter from Lila. It arrived on expensive stationery, delivered through the prison mail system and written in the careful handwriting of someone who had far too much time to think about their mistakes. I almost threw it away without reading it, but curiosity got the better of me. Dear Martha, it began, and I had to admire her audacity in using my first name after trying to murder me. I know you probably don't want to hear from me, but I need you to understand that I never meant for things to go as far as they did. What happened at dinner that night was an accident. Mother and I were only trying to make you a little sick, to prove that you needed medical attention and supervision. An accident. They were only trying to make me a little sick. The revisionist history was breathtaking in its dishonesty. The letter continued for 3 pages, alternating between self-pity and attempts at justification. Lila claimed she'd been desperate, that Mark's financial problems had driven her to desperation, that she'd never intended to actually kill me. But the most revealing part came near the end. I know you'll never forgive me, but I hope you can find it in your heart to think about Chloe's future. She's going to need college tuition, support for her adult life, security that Mark can't provide on his own. You're the only one with the resources to ensure she has the opportunities she deserves. Even from prison, even after being convicted of trying to murder me, Lila was still trying to manipulate me into giving her family money. The audacity was almost impressive. I set the letter aside and thought about how I wanted to respond, if at all. Part of me wanted to ignore it completely, to let Lila wonder whether I'd even received her attempt at emotional manipulation. But another part of me wanted to respond, to make sure she understood exactly how thoroughly she'd failed in her scheme. In the end, I chose a middle path. I wrote a brief, formal response that I sent through my lawyer. Ms. Morrison, I received your letter dated March 15th. I want to be very clear about several points. What you did was not an accident. It was attempted murder, as confirmed by your conviction in a court of law. Your claim that you were only trying to make me a little sick is contradicted by the evidence, including your own recorded statements about ensuring my health finally failed. Your continued attempts to manipulate me into providing financial support for your family demonstrate that you have learned nothing from your crimes or their consequences. Chloe's future is indeed important to me, which is why I have established a trust fund for her education and support that will be managed by independent trustees. This fund specifically excludes any access or benefit for you, even after your release from prison. You chose greed over family, manipulation over love, and murder over patience. You will live with the consequences of those choices for the rest of your life. Do not contact me again. Martha Benjamin. I never received another letter from Lila, though I heard through Mark that she'd been furious about my response. Apparently, she'd expected me to be more forgiving, more willing to move past her attempt to kill me for the sake of family harmony. She'd severely underestimated me, just as she'd underestimated the consequences of her actions. Joan, meanwhile, had taken a different approach to her imprisonment. Rather than attempting reconciliation, she'd embraced victimhood, telling anyone who would listen that she'd been unfairly prosecuted for a family misunderstanding. She claimed I'd orchestrated the entire situation out of spite, that I'd somehow poisoned my own food and then switched plates to frame her and Lila. The conspiracy theories she spun were elaborate and completely unhinged, but they provided her with a narrative that allowed her to avoid taking responsibility for her crimes. I heard about her claims through Detective Rodriguez, who occasionally updated me on developments in the case. She's actually gotten some of the other inmates to believe her story, Sarah told me during one of our periodic phone calls. According to the prison staff, she's positioned herself as some kind of martyred grandmother who is victimized by a vindictive rich woman. Does anyone in authority believe her version of events? Not a chance. The evidence was too overwhelming, and her own recorded statements contradict everything she's claiming now. But it gives her a way to maintain her self-image as the wronged party rather than the attempted murderer she actually is. I found Joan's fantasy world almost amusing. If believing she was the victim helped her cope with prison life, then she was welcome to her delusions. The important thing was that she was locked away where she couldn't hurt anyone else. The real work of rebuilding our family continued throughout that first year after the trial. Mark had completed his divorce proceedings and was doing well in therapy, slowly coming to terms with the fact that he'd been married to a woman who was capable of murder. He'd also started dating again, very cautiously, with the help of a therapist who specialized in helping people recover from relationships with manipulative partners. Chloe had finished her senior year of high school and been accepted to Northwestern, where she planned to study psychology with a focus on family trauma. She was still in therapy, but she was healing in the way that young people can when they're surrounded by genuine love and support. "I want to understand how people like Mom and Grandma Joan think," she told me one evening as we worked in my garden together. "I want to help other families recognize the warning signs before someone gets hurt." "That's a noble goal, sweetheart. But make sure you're doing it for the right reasons. Don't let their crimes define your entire life." "I won't. But I also won't pretend they didn't happen. What they did to you, to our family, to me, it matters. And maybe I can use what I learned to help other people." I was proud of her resilience, her ability to transform trauma into purpose. She would be fine, better than fine. She would be extraordinary. The financial aspects of the case had been resolved as well. The investigation had revealed that Lila and Joan had been planning not just my murder, but a systematic theft of my assets that would have continued for years. They'd researched how to have me declared incompetent, how to gain control of my financial accounts, and how to liquidate my investments without triggering suspicion. My lawyer James had been horrified by the scope of their planning. "Martha, if they'd succeeded in either killing you or having you declared incompetent, they would have stolen everything. Your house, your investments, the business William built. All of it would have been transferred to Mark's name and then controlled by Lila." But they didn't succeed. No, they didn't. And the new estate planning documents we prepared protected everything. The charitable donations triggered by suspicious circumstances have been canceled since you're very much alive and competent. But the protective clauses remain in place, just in case. Just in case. Because once someone in your family tries to murder you, you never quite feel safe again. But I was learning to live with that reality. I'd upgraded my home security system, installed cameras that monitored every entrance, and arranged for regular check-ins with friends and neighbors. I'd also taken self-defense classes and learned about personal protection options that were both legal and effective. Most importantly, I'd learned to trust my instincts completely. If something felt wrong, I investigated. If someone's behavior raised red flags, I paid attention. If a situation seemed dangerous, I removed myself immediately. The experience had made me more cautious, but it had also made me stronger. I knew now that I was capable of protecting myself against even the most intimate betrayals. I knew that I could gather evidence, build cases, and fight back against people who saw me as easy prey. I also knew that justice, while sometimes slow, was ultimately available to those who were willing to fight for it. As the first anniversary of Joan's poisoning approached, I found myself reflecting on everything that had changed in my life. I'd lost a daughter-in-law and a granddaughter-in-law to prison, but I'd gained a deeper relationship with my son and granddaughter. I discovered that I was capable of surviving betrayal and fighting back against people who wanted to destroy me. Most importantly, I'd learned that family isn't defined by blood or marriage. It's defined by love, respect, and the willingness to protect each other from harm. The people who'd tried to poison me had never been my real family. They'd been predators wearing the masks of relatives, using the language of love to hide their murderous intentions. My real family was sitting around my dinner table every Sunday night. Mark, who'd found the courage to leave his toxic marriage and rebuild his life. Chloe, who'd warned me about the poison and saved my life. And the friends who'd supported me through the investigation and trial. We were smaller than before, but we were genuine. We were honest with each other, protective of each other, and committed to building something beautiful from the ashes of what had been destroyed. And every time we shared a meal together, every time we laughed and talked and enjoyed each other's company, it felt like the sweetest revenge of all. Because they'd tried to destroy me, and instead, they'd only made me stronger. 2 years after Joan's conviction, I decided to host one final dinner party. Not for Lila and Joan. They were serving their sentences and would remain in prison for years to come. This dinner would be for the family members who mattered. Mark, Chloe, and the friends who'd become family through the crucible of attempted murder and its aftermath. But there was one more guest I wanted to invite, someone whose presence would complete the circle of justice that had defined the past 2 years. Margaret Chen, my private investigator, had become more than a professional contact. She'd become a friend, a confidant, and the person who'd helped me gather the evidence that ultimately saved my life and destroyed my enemies. She deserved to be part of this celebration. I planned the menu carefully, choosing dishes that were both delicious and symbolic. Prime rib, because life is too short for inferior meat. Yorkshire pudding, because some traditions are worth preserving even when families fall apart. Roasted vegetables from my own garden, tended by my own hands and free from any substances that might cause harm. And for dessert, chocolate trifle, the same dessert I'd been serving when Joan collapsed, but this time made with love instead of murderous intent. The invitations went out a week before the dinner, handwritten on beautiful stationery and delivered personally to each guest. I wanted this evening to be special, memorable, a celebration of survival and justice and the family we'd built from the ruins of what had been destroyed. Mark arrived first, looking healthier and happier than he had in years. Therapy had been good for him, and so had his new relationship with Elena, a kind and intelligent woman who worked as a victim's advocate and understood the complexities of recovering from family trauma. "Mom, you look amazing," he said, kissing my cheek as he handed me a bottle of wine. "This whole dinner party idea, are you sure you're ready for this?" "I'm more than ready, sweetheart. I'm excited." Chloe arrived next, radiant in her first year of college and already talking about graduate school and her plans to specialize in family therapy. She'd grown into a beautiful young woman with William's eyes and my stubborn determination to make the world a better place. "Grandma, I brought someone I want you to meet," she said, introducing her boyfriend David, a sweet pre-med student who looked at her like she hung the moon. Margaret arrived last, carrying flowers and wearing the satisfied expression of someone who'd helped achieve perfect justice. "Martha, this is quite an occasion. How does it feel to be hosting a dinner party where no one's trying to poison anyone?" "Remarkably peaceful," I said with a laugh. "Also somewhat anticlimactic. I'd forgotten how pleasant meal preparation could be when you're not worried about being murdered." We gathered in the dining room, the same room where Joan had collapsed 2 years earlier, but transformed now by different company and different intentions. The table was set with my finest china, the crystal caught the candlelight beautifully, and the conversation flowed as easily as the wine. As we ate, I found myself thinking about the contrast between this dinner and that fatal evening 2 years ago. Then, I'd been surrounded by people who saw me as an obstacle to be eliminated. Tonight, I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about my well-being and celebrated my survival. The difference was profound. "I want to propose a toast," Mark said as we finished the main course. "To Mom, who taught us all that sometimes the most loving thing you can do is fight back against people who want to hurt you. To Martha," Margaret added, "who showed that victims don't have to stay victims and that evidence properly gathered can be more powerful than any weapon. To Grandma," Chloe said, her voice thick with emotion, "who saved not just herself, but all of us, by refusing to let evil people win." We raised our glasses, and I felt a warmth that had nothing to do with the wine. This was what family was supposed to feel like: supportive, protective, celebrating each other's successes instead of plotting each other's destruction. As I served the chocolate trifle, I couldn't help but smile at the irony. This dessert had been present at the scene of my would-be murder's downfall, and now it was part of a celebration of survival and justice. "Margaret," I said as we enjoyed our dessert, "I have something for you." I handed her a small wrapped box containing a beautiful silver locket that had belonged to my mother. "This is from my family's jewelry collection. I want you to have it as a thank you for helping me save my life." Margaret opened the locket to reveal a tiny photograph of William and me on our wedding day, young and hopeful and completely unaware of the challenges that lay ahead. "Martha, this is beautiful, but I can't accept something so valuable." "You can and you will. You helped me preserve not just my life, but the legacy William and I built together. That locket represents family, real family, the kind that protects and cherishes rather than exploits and destroys." As the evening wound down and our guests prepared to leave, I found myself standing in my kitchen, washing dishes and reflecting on the journey that had brought me to this moment. 2 years ago, I'd been the target of a murder plot by people who were supposed to love me. I'd been isolated, manipulated, and systematically poisoned by family members who saw my death as a solution to their financial problems. Tonight, I was surrounded by people who genuinely cared about me, who celebrated my strength and resilience, who'd helped me transform victimhood into victory. The contrast was stark and satisfying. After everyone left, I walked through my house, checking locks and setting alarms, habits I developed during the investigation and maintained for my own peace of mind. But as I moved through rooms filled with beautiful things I'd chosen myself, surrounded by memories of genuine love and authentic relationships, I felt safer than I had in years. Not because the threats were gone. Lila and Joan would eventually be released from prison, and there was no guarantee they'd learned anything from their incarceration. But because I'd learned that I was capable of protecting myself, of fighting back against even the most intimate betrayals, of building a life worth defending. In my bedroom, I paused at William's photograph on my nightstand. "We did it," I whispered to his smiling face. "We protected what we built together. We made sure the people who tried to destroy us faced justice. And we found a way to build something beautiful from the ashes of their betrayal." As I settled into bed, I reflected on the lessons I'd learned over the past 2 years. Trust your instincts. Document everything. Fight back when necessary. Build your real family from people who earn your love rather than demanding it by accident of birth. Most importantly, some people will see your kindness as weakness and your love as opportunity. When that happens, the most loving thing you can do for yourself and for everyone else is to show them the consequences of their choices. I'd given Lila and Joan every opportunity to treat me with respect and genuine affection. Instead, they'd chosen greed, manipulation, and attempted murder. Now they were living with the results of those choices, while I was free to enjoy the life they'd tried to steal from me. It wasn't the ending I would have chosen 2 years ago, when I still believed that family bonds were sacred and unbreakable. But it was the ending that justice demanded, and it was the beginning of something much better than what I'd lost. As I drifted off to sleep in my beautiful bedroom, in my secure house, surrounded by the evidence of a life well-lived and properly defended, I felt a deep satisfaction that went beyond mere revenge. I had survived. I had fought back. I had won. And tomorrow, I would wake up free to live my life on my own terms, surrounded by people who truly loved me, protected by my own strength and intelligence, and secure in the knowledge that some battles are worth fighting, especially when you're fighting for your own life. The quiet war was over. The victory was complete. And the rest of my life stretched ahead of me like an unwritten page, full of possibilities that my would-be murderers would never be able to steal. In the end, they'd given me the greatest gift of all, They'd shown me exactly who I was when everything was on the line. I was Martha Benjamin, and I was magnificent. 3 years later, I received news that would close this chapter of my life forever. Joan had died in prison, not from poison, but from the kind of slow, natural decline that comes to those who spend their final years consumed by bitterness and regret. The guards reported that she'd never stopped claiming she was innocent, never stopped insisting that I had somehow orchestrated her downfall. She died alone, unmourned by the family she'd tried to destroy, a cautionary tale about the price of choosing greed over love. Lila was still serving her sentence, with 8 more years before she'd be eligible for parole. According to Mark, who occasionally received updates through the prison system, she'd become a model prisoner, taking classes, working in the prison library, apparently trying to rebuild her life from the ground up. Whether her transformation was genuine or simply another manipulation remained to be seen.
But it no longer mattered to me.
She was a stranger now, someone who'd once been part of my life, but who had forfeited any claim to my attention or concern when she decided to solve her problems with poison. Mark had married Elena the previous spring, in a beautiful ceremony at my house where Chloe served as maid of honor, and I walked my son down the aisle to give him to a woman who truly deserved his love. It was a celebration of second chances and new beginnings, attended by friends who'd supported us through the darkest period of our lives. Chloe had graduated summa cum laude and been accepted to graduate school in clinical psychology. She was writing her thesis on family trauma and recovery, using our experience as a case study in how toxic relationships could be transformed into healthy ones through truth, justice, and unconditional love. "Grandma," she'd said during our last conversation before she left for graduate school, "I want you to know that what you did, fighting back, gathering evidence, making sure they faced consequences, it didn't just save your life. It saved mine too." "How do you mean?" "I was learning from them. Mom and Grandma Joan were teaching me that manipulation was normal, that lying was acceptable, that family loyalty meant enabling bad behavior. If you hadn't stopped them, I might have grown up thinking that was how people were supposed to treat each other." "You would have figured it out eventually, sweetheart. You're too smart and too good to have fallen into their patterns permanently." "Maybe. But I'm grateful I didn't have to find out the hard way." As for me, I'd spent the past 3 years building a life that was entirely my own. I'd traveled extensively, seeing places William and I had always planned to visit but never found time for. I'd redecorated my house to reflect my own tastes rather than traditional expectations of how a widow should live. I'd taken art classes, learned to play piano, and discovered that there were whole parts of myself I'd never had the freedom to explore. I'd also become something of an expert on elder abuse prevention, consulting with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy groups about how to recognize and document financial exploitation by family members. My case had become a textbook example of how systematic evidence gathering could build an unassailable criminal case against even the most intimate betrayals. But perhaps most importantly, I'd learned to live without fear. Not because the world had become safer. If anything, my experience had taught me how dangerous it could be to trust the wrong people. But because I discovered that I was capable of protecting myself against even the most calculated threats. I was Martha Benjamin, survivor of attempted murder, destroyer of family predators, and creator of something beautiful from the ashes of betrayal. I was 61 years old, and I was just getting started. The dinner party I'd hosted to celebrate justice had become an annual tradition. Every year on the anniversary of Joan's poisoning, I gathered my real family around my table to celebrate survival, resilience, and the triumph of love over greed. This year's dinner would be special because it would mark not just the anniversary of their failed murder attempt, but the completion of their punishment and their final removal from my life forever. They tried to make that October evening my last supper. Instead, they'd given me the first meal of my new life, a life free from their toxicity, protected by my own strength, and enriched by relationships built on genuine care rather than financial calculation. As I planned this year's menu, I smiled at the thought of what Lila would be eating in her prison while I dined on delicacies prepared with love and served to people who truly valued my presence at their table. Some revenge is served cold. But the sweetest revenge of all is served warm, surrounded by people who love you, in a house you've made safe through your own courage and intelligence. The last supper they'd planned for me had become the first feast of my freedom, and every meal I'd shared since then had been a celebration of their failure and my victory. I was alive. I was free. I was loved by people who deserve my love in return. And that was the most delicious revenge of all. Thank you for joining us on Martha's incredible journey from victim to victor. Her story reminds us that family isn't always about blood. It's about who stands by you when your life is threatened and who celebrates with you when justice is served. Martha's courage to document evidence, trust her instincts, and fight back against those who tried to destroy her shows us that it's never too late to refuse to be a victim. If Martha's story resonated with you, if it gave you strength to trust your own instincts or inspired you to protect yourself from toxic relationships, please share it. Hit that like button to support stories that show women standing up for themselves and winning against impossible odds. Subscribe to her true stories for more accounts of survival, justice, and the triumph of good over evil. Remember, you don't owe anyone access to your life, your resources, or your safety just because they're family. Sometimes the most loving thing you can do is protect yourself from people who see your kindness as weakness and your trust as opportunity. In the comments below, share your thoughts on Martha's choices. Have you ever had to trust your instincts when everyone around you was telling you that you were wrong? How did you find the courage to protect yourself? Your stories matter, and they might be exactly what another woman needs to hear today. Until next time, remember that some dinners are worth fighting for, some families are worth building from scratch, and some victories taste even sweeter when they're served with justice on the side.